So today we are honored and excited to be joined together with Dr. Domenic D'Ettore to discuss the medieval debates centered around the use of analogical predication in syllogistic demonstrations. Dr. D'Ettore received his Doctorate of Philosophy from the Center of Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. His research focuses on the thought of the great 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas and on the reception and development of Aquinas' thought in the following centuries. He has served in the Department of Theology and Philosophy at Marian University since fall 2012, and he has written several articles and books on the subject of analogy, including Analogy After Aquinas, Logical Problems, Thomistic Answers. Dr. D'Ettore, thank you so much for joining with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you, Hunter. Thanks for the invitation.
So I figured that before we dive into the Thomistic defenders of analogy, we'd sort of give a brief history of the debate of analogy and the use of analogy in demonstration. I made a video, an episode devoted to that, but if we could just sort of briefly summarize the debate. What is the debate on analogy and univocity about? Are there any sort of concerns put forward about the use of analogy and in syllogistic demonstration?
Sure. So you could say that the matter of analogy comes down to two basic issues in the Aristotelian tradition: science and demonstration. With science, of course, preceding demonstration, since a demonstration is supposed to occur in a science. So sciences are supposed to be about some genus, demonstrating the properties, causes, and the principles of the members of some subject genus. So the problem then arises for Aristotle when he brings up the science of being as being and steadfastly maintains at once that there is no such thing as a genus of being. So he has to come up with a way in which there is sufficient unity for science of being as being to have demonstrations without trying to say that being is also a genus after all. And so we see in metaphysics for Aristotle saying, well, turns out that metaphysics or wisdom can have sufficient unity, just like medicine can have sufficient unity, even though not all of the things studied in medicine belong to the same genus. But everything that you study in medicine does relate back to the health of an animal. So effectively, everything that you're studying in medicine has some kind of analogous relationship to the healthiness of an animal. So likewise, in the study of wisdom, we can be studying the causes and the principles of being as being, provided that we are studying substance, and all the other modes of being relate by analogy to the being of substance. Now, pushing that along into the medieval debate, they are concerned about how we're going to get our demonstrations, whether in metaphysics in general, so making demonstrations that will apply to being as set across the categories, but more importantly, for the medieval philosophers, how do we make claims about God and the ultimate principle and cause of being on the basis of what we know about creatures, if God and creatures don't share in some common genus of being? So they bring up something else they get from Aristotle, which is this fallacy of equivocation. Okay, so I know, Hunter, that you're familiar with the fallacy of equivocation. Do you want to run through a fallacy of equivocation for us here?
Sure. So as I understand it, one of the common models for using analogy is to talk about healthiness. So we can talk about healthiness predicated of animal and animality, but we can also predicate healthiness of products of the animal, such as their urine or their feces, which signify the state of healthiness in an animal. But one of the difficulties with using that model is it's very easy to equivocate with the analogates. So we could say that I think a common example is everything that's healthy is an animal. Urine is healthy, therefore urine is an animal. You're obviously equivocating the different meanings of healthy there.
Okay, good. And that's a standard medieval textbook example. Okay, so when we're thinking about the fallacy of equivocation, we're thinking about a case where you're using a term more than once in your argument, presumably in a syllogistic argument, and you're using it to mean with one meaning the first time that you use it in the sentence, in the argument, and you're using it with a different meaning in your second proposition in the argument. So if your argument is all dogs bark, the star called the dog star is dog, therefore the star barks, you've committed the fallacy of equivocation. That's another one of the standard examples in the medieval logic textbooks. Or if you say that banks are where it is that you deposit money, the side of the river is a bank, therefore the side of the river is for depositing money, you've got an example of the fallacy of equivocation. You've equivocated on that word bank. So the concern is if the word being is used like the word healthy in metaphysics demonstrations or demonstrations about God and creatures, are you going to fall into the same fallacy as you fall into when you use the word bark, when you use the word dog to refer to the animal and to refer to the star, or the word bank to refer to the place where you deposit money and to the side of the river? And as you pointed out, with the example of the word healthy, that is in the standard medieval textbooks. Okay? Everything healthy is alive. Medicine is healthy. Therefore, medicine is alive.
As I understand it, really what's at stake here is whether or not we can syllogistically demonstrate things, the subject matter in metaphysics, or the existence of God. Because if what is being employed here in the study of being is equivocal terms, then ultimately syllogistic reasoning is impossible.
Right. You want to move from what you do know to what you don't know. That's the order of discovery. And what we do know about being, we first know about the beings of our experience, what we'll call for simplicity, created being. Well, if created being is equivocal to a divine being, like the side of a river is equivocal to the place where you deposit money, you're not going to learn anything about God. It's not even going to be meaningful to say that God is a being if there is that kind of equivocation.
I see. So we talked earlier about the we mentioned healthy as a model, but as I understand it, there's sort of two sort of models that medieval theologians will use in sort of describing how analogy works, and it's taken from Boethius's sort of fourfold division of analogy. But what would you say are sort of the two main contenders for how we should model our analogical predication?
So our two models are that healthy model of analogy, the one that we've been talking about, where we've got our primary sense of healthy, which refers to the health of an animal, and you can define that in one way or another, something along the lines of the organs having their proper disposition so that the animal would carry out its functions. And other things are called healthy because they are either a sign of that health in the animal, or they are contributing in one way or another to that health in the animal, or have some other kind of relation to that health in the animal. In one way or another, the healthiness of the animal shows up in the definition of the healthiness of these other things, whether it's the healthiness of the exercise, the healthiness of the diet, the healthiness of the urine, the healthiness of the medicine. And so that's one of our models of analogy. And a overarching term that's sometimes used for that model of analogy is analogy of attribution. So if you go into the literature and you see the term analogy of attribution, well, that's what it is that they're talking about. Another model for analogy is what in my book I call the principal model of analogy. And I stole that terminology from the late Father Lawrence Dewan, who also spoke of the healthy model of analogy and principal model of analogy. Now, for our principal model of analogy, our source of inspiration is mathematical ratios or proportions. So you can think of 1 relates to 2 as 3 relates to 6. Okay, that's an example of a mathematical proportion, or even we could say mathematical analogy. Mathematical proportion or mathematical analogy gets extended outside of quantity, and that's where we get analogy of the sort that we're interested here in our discussion. That's where we get the kind of analogies that if you ever take another standardized test, you'll probably have an analogies section there on the standardized tests. Those kinds of analogies are our principal model of analogies, where what we're considering here are different but interrelated proportions. So the proportion of 1 to 2 is analogously similar to the proportion of 3 to 6. The proportion of a, say, one price we can describe as higher than another price, and we can describe the height of a mountain as higher than another mountain. Okay, so the proportion of one price to another price is proportionally similar to the proportion of height of one mountain to another mountain. Okay, so we call in both cases higher. So higher is said of prices analogously to the way higher is said of mountains. Okay. And we can say the same thing about lower. Or if I talk about a voice, I could say that a voice is deep, and I can say that a ditch is deep. Well, a ditch and a voice aren't in the same genus. They're not both generically deep, but the proportion of the depth of a ditch can be compared to the proportion of the depth of a voice, and we say that they are analogously deep.
Gotcha. All right, then. So one of the so before we discuss the later Thomists, I figured maybe we could also discuss very briefly how Thomas Aquinas understands an analogical predication and its role in metaphysics, and maybe also discuss maybe later Henry of Ghent and eventually Duns Scotus's grievances. One of the difficulties with Thomas is that there isn't like a Summa article or a treatise where he just sits down and discusses analogy. Aquinas' understanding of analogy is kind of a fragmented legacy where you have one sort of theory way back in his Sentences commentary, then another that he gives in like the De Veritate, and it's all just scattered throughout his works, his sort of musings on analogy.
Yeah, and different theories within the same work.
So if we could go sort of briefly over that, what would you take to what does Aquinas take to be sort of the ideal model for analogy? Is he taken with sort of health, or is he taken with proportionality? What's his preference?
We're getting into one of the great debated questions in interpretation of Thomas Aquinas, and even within that debate, you have some who will argue that there's a developmental model to look at, so that Aquinas changes his mind over the course of his life. You've got others who will argue that you can figure out from context what it is that Aquinas is interested in, and that in fact there isn't a development of his thought at all. But depending on what it is that he's trying to do, it will employ one model of analogy versus some other kind of analogy, and that it all really just actually fits together.
I see.
Joshua Hochschild has an article in which he gives what I find to be the most ambitious attempt in one journal-length article to actually fit the whole thing together, where there wouldn't actually be any development whatsoever, but Aquinas has particular uses for what we'll just call analogy of attribution, and particular uses for what we can call the principal model of analogy, or analogy of proportionality.
And another difficulty that we haven't addressed yet is Well, we've addressed sort of the equivocation problem that later thinkers are going to have to wrestle with, and we've also touched on the sort of model problem. But there's another problem sort of in the background of in our use of syllogistic, demonstration analogy. Do we employ one concept or do we employ more than one concept? Is there a multiplicity of concepts that we use in our reasoning? And if so, I mean, how does that tack on to equivocation and univocity? Would you say that that's another sort of concern in the back of the medieval's mind?
Sure. And this comes back to their understanding of signification. So I don't know whether or not you did a video on Aristotle's On Interpretation at any point, but right towards the beginning of Aristotle's On Interpretation, he presents what later thinkers will describe as the Semantic Triangle. You're familiar with the Semantic Triangle?
I've heard it, but it has been a while, I'm afraid.
Okay. So you've got your vocal sounds or written symbols of vocal sounds that for simplicity we'll just call words. And they are significations and they signify concepts. Okay, so the concepts would be effectively what it is that's in your mind, that is your mind representing or signifying something. So your words signify concepts, and your concepts signify things. And then one of the great debate is what is the thing that is being signified? Is it an individual, or is it some kind of a common nature? So when you have univocity, you've got a single word that is signifying some individuals or some nature shared by those individuals through one and the same concept. And when you have equivocity, it's when you have one and the same word signifying things that don't share a common nature through different concepts. So if we go back to our example of the word bank. So we can say that if I have my one word bank, and I've got my concept of bank, and my concept of bank is a place where money is deposited. And that signifies, say, Chase Bank and bank where I used to work when I was in university, the Royal Bank of Canada. Signifies them univocally because they both share in the nature of being the place where you deposit money. But when I, again, go back to that word bank and that concept of bank as a place where you deposit money, and then I add another concept of bank, such as the side of a river, well, now I've got two concepts for one word, and they signify different things. Okay, so now I've got the equivocation. So now the trick is, or how do you work analogy into that? Can it be the case that I've got one concept for my one word that is signifying things that have diverse natures? Or do I need to still have two concepts, just like with equivocation, to signify the things with the diverse natures? And if that is the case, why isn't that equivocation, or just the same thing as equivocation? And if it's the one concept that's signifying the things with the diverse natures, why not say that that's univocation?
I see. All right, then. So with Aquinas, we've got a rather fragmented legacy with respect to analogy, and it's sort of the job of his later interpreters to sort of pick up the pieces and try to make sense of this doctrine of analogy. And then there's another medieval thinker, Henry of Ghent, who also has his own sort of model of analogy, and he sort of expressly thinks that we have it's two concepts signifying both God and creation, and they're so similar that to each other that they need not warrant equivocation or a fallacy in our reasoning. Would you say that that is a fair characterization of his position?
Sure. So Henry of Ghent thinks that you necessarily have diverse concepts, one referring to God, one referring to creatures. So if I'm saying that God is a being, creatures are beings, I'm not using the same concept of being in the statement about creatures and then the statement about God. Okay, so the one is negatively undetermined, and the other one is, in his terminology, privatively undetermined. But if you're not concentrating on the difference between the two of them, you could easily confuse one for the other. And Henry's account of analogy is sometimes described as an analogy of confusion. Confusion here simply meaning that you are not noticing at the time that you're thinking about it that you have two concepts. And so it seems to you that you have one when you really have two.
Interesting.
And Scotus thinks that this is useless.
Right. If we could go into Duns Scotus's sort of grievances with analogy, as I understand it, he very much objects to using analogy in our demonstration because he thinks it falls into equivocation. And one of the arguments that he sort of posits in favor of this single concept of being is that if we look at the pre-Socratics, they weren't aware, whether the first principle was, was water or fire, was a substance or an infinite or finite being, but they were sure that there was a first principle, there was a being. And so Duns Scotus reasons that, okay, independent of our concepts of infinite and finite being and substance and an accident, there has to be a separate concept, kind of like an ens rationis of being, and they sort of tack on our other concepts of infinity and finite infinitude or substance and accident onto that concept. Would you say that that's right?
Yeah, that's a nice summary of what in the literature gets called the argument from a certain and doubtful concept. And it is even sometimes called the famous argument from a certain and a doubtful concept. Scotus gives that example, or gives that argument in different variations throughout his work. One of the variations that he gives that you might find useful for thinking about it is an argument about light. You ever wondered what light is? Stop and think about it. But apparently medieval philosophers were very interested in the question, what is light? Or you could even think in terms of today's disputes about light, where they wonder, is it a wave or is it a particle? Okay. Now, you could say that if you're the contemporary physicist, you're certain that light exists, but you're uncertain of whether it is a wave or a particle. So that tells you that your concept of existence can't be the same concept as your concept of a wave or your concept of a particle. Because you can't be certain and doubtful through exactly the same concept. Now, for the medieval physicists, they didn't put in terms of waves or particles, but they did consider the question, is light a substance or is light an accident? So if I'm certain that light exists, certain it's a being, but I'm uncertain if it's a substance or if it's an accident, that means that I have to have a concept of being that is distinguishable from my concept of substance and from my concept of accident. And that this concept applies to substance and accidents, because substance and accidents are beings. And so Scotus thinks that by this kind of argumentation, I can establish that I have a distinct concept of being from the concepts of substance and accidents that applies to both of them. And so therefore, I have a univocal concept of being over and above substantial being and accidental being.
I see.
I thought that was an easier presentation of the argument than the one that where he goes into the pre-Socratic. So that's why I brought that up.
I mean, it's a lot. It's much more relatable to how in the world today, how contemporary physicists are concerned about how we understand light. That okay, we're sure that it's something that exists, but what exactly that something is, we're not quite sure. I think that's much more helpful. Okay, so it looks like we've got sort of three main problems, and in your book you sort of list them as such, as sort of the ratio problem, the analogy model problem, or what model we should use, and then the equivocation problem. So with ratio problem, is it one concept that we employ? Is it multiple concepts? And if it's multiple concepts, how do we avoid equivocation? And how exactly does analogy avoid equivocation? And then finally, which model ought we employ in our reasoning and in metaphysics?
Yeah, and we could also add in here, if analogy is using one concept in an argument, why isn't it just univocity? That's the other option.
I see. All right. Well, I figured then that was a great summary and presentation. I figured then that we could probably just jump right into some of the early Thomists, the Hervaeus Natalis and Thomas Sutton. So who are these? I believe you call them sort of primitive Thomists, or the princes of primitive Thomism. Who are these two thinkers?
Okay. Well, we've got, in the case of Hervaeus Natalis, someone who became the master general of the Dominican order. He's kind of an eclectic figure in his own right. He did write some work specifically in defense of the thought of Aquinas against Scotist criticisms. He wrote a work on being and essence, so basically stealing a title from one of Aquinas's works. He's got a series of quod-libital questions, and typically in the history of philosophy, it's just quod-libital questions that people go to for his understanding of analogy. So if you're going to look at later figures in the Thomist tradition and they're trying to go to the position of Hervaeus Natalis, they're going to go to his quod-libital questions. If you look at Suarez and he's going to make reference to Hervaeus Natalis, he's going to go to his quod-libital questions. So from the perspective of this particular dispute, Hervaeus Natalis is a famous author of some quod-libital questions. Nice. And for our audience's benefit here, a quod-libital question is a ask me anything kind of question. So Natalis would have shown up in his capacity as a master and been asked a series of questions and given his answers to those questions, and then gone back later on and edited his answers to those questions as they were recorded by somebody else. And those would have been published as his answers to these whatever, or quod-libital.
And then what about Thomas Sutton? As I understand it, he was a contemporary of Natalis, and I do believe that he was alive during the time that Aquinas was alive. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So if I'm remembering my dates correctly, Thomas Sutton was born around 1250, and so Aquinas dies when Sutton is in his early 20s. Now, as far as I know, there's no reason to believe that Sutton ever met Aquinas, but Sutton most likely would have encountered Scotus, or at least people that knew Scotus, during Sutton's time at the University of Oxford. Okay, so you have Sutton as the English Dominican and Natalis as the French Dominican. Natalis's works on analogy are mostly talked about through his work. I'm trying to remember now the name of the work. His ordinary questions, or our Latin expression, questiones ordinariae. And within those texts, we find Sutton much more so than Natalis giving extensive treatments and quotations of passages from Thomas Aquinas, notably from his Summa Contra Gentiles, but not only from his Summa Contra Gentiles. And depending upon which author it is that you're looking at. Some people think that Scotus is responding to Sutton, and others are thinking that Sutton is responding to Scotus, and it's quite likely a mixture of both of those things going on.
Interesting. All right, then. So I guess we'll start with Natalis. What is Natalis's take on the Ratzianas problem? How does he sort of try to answer this problem? As I understand it, Natalis begins by sort of distinguishing between a formal concept and an objective concept. So we've got a ratio or concept in the intellect, and the intelligible content in Ray and in the thing. Would you say that that's correct?
Yes, and one of the questions is he originating this distinction? Is he taking it from somebody else? There's a Franciscan named Peter Oriel, who's a contemporary of Natalis, who's coming up with the same distinction. Some people attribute to him, I guess you could say, the rights of ownership over being the author of this distinction.
Gotcha.
But there's a foundation for this distinction in the writings of Aquinas as well. If you look to his commentary on the sentences, he has a passage in which he makes a distinction between the ratio in the intellect and the soul, and the ratio in the thing. And so to use your, as you did very well, your terminology there, we could say that the ratio in the thing is the intelligible content of the nature of some object. And we call it a ratio precisely insofar as it is being understood by some intellect. Right? So you're a human being, you have human nature, and we would refer to your human nature as a ratio in the thing, precisely when we're thinking of your human nature as being understood by or thought about by some intellect. So it's your nature as it is related to some reason thinking about it that makes it a take on being a ratio.
Sure.
And then the ratio in the intellect is effectively the concept that your intellect forms to actually think about things. Okay, so the formal concept or ratio in the intellect is what we really mean by concept.
Okay. All right, then tagging this onto the Ratzianas problem, would he hold that there's a multiplicity of ratio in things and a singular concept in the intellect, or a multiplicity of concepts in the intellect? How does he sort of bridge those two together?
So Natalis is quite firm that you have a distinct ratio in your intellect for the things that don't share a common nature. Right? So you have a different concept of being for substantial being than your concept of being for quantitative being or qualitative being. You have a different concept of being for created being and for divine or uncreated being. And so if they're not sharing a nature, then they're not sharing in any formal concept.
I see.
I suppose that maybe Natalis would grant that, well, sure, you could form a formal concept that signifies both divine and created being. You're just wrong.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, and as I understand it, with respect to Duns Scotus's argument of the certain and doubtful, Natalis puts forward the suggestion that, well, no, it's not a single concept that's distinct from our concepts of God and creatures or substance and accident. Rather, we form a sort of disjunctive syllogism, or a sort of just disjunctive conceptual unity. It's either going to be this or that.
That's right. Yeah. So for Natalis, your certitude that light is either a substance or an accident. Your certitude that it's a being is your certitude that it has substantial being or accidental being.
I see.
It's not that you have some separate concept of being that's not the concept of substantial being and not the concept of accidental being. Any concept of being that you have is the concept of substantial being, or it's the concept of accidental being. And you could set these together in a disjunction substantial being or quantitative being or qualitative being or relative being or action being or passive being, etc.
Gotcha. And then how does Natalis sort of use his understanding of the ratio and the concepts to answer the problem of equivocation? As I understand it, he gives a very subtle account of our concepts and the ratio and the thing and the intellect, but with equivocation, I don't think he's as strong on in answering this problem.
What Natalis tries to do to solve the problem of equivocation is to insist, well, there's something the same. Right? There's something the same about the being of God and the being of creatures, the wisdom of God and the wisdom of creatures, much as there's something the same about the healthiness of the medicine and the healthiness of an animal.
But he doesn't.
And so we don't end up making a mistake.
Okay.
And that's what he insists. He says there's no deception that takes place in the argument. But he's not really clear on why there being something the same, or what exactly that something the same would be that would prevent the fallacy of equivocation from happening. And I see this as particularly problematic given the context in which he's writing, where a standard example of the fallacy of equivocation is these examples of health being said by analogy, where it would seem that on his criteria, well, there's something the same. That something the same would be the definition of healthiness as it applies to an animal. It's also in the definition of healthiness as it applies to urine. But that doesn't allow you to use your word healthy analogously in an argument and avoid the fallacy of equivocation.
Right.
To the extent to which he has any solution to that he offers in his brief remarks, it's his insisting, well, there isn't any deception when you make these arguments going from what we know about creatures to trying to draw a conclusion about God.
Gotcha. All right, so Natalis has given us an answer to the Ratzianas problem. He sort of tried to answer the equivocation problem. How does he answer the model problem? Does he opt for healthy or proportionality? Does he have a preference for?
Yeah, he gives the healthy model of analogy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then. Well, I think that was a good analysis of Natalis. Now turning to Sutton, how does Sutton answer the ratio and the model problem in analogy?
So Sutton agrees with Natalis. He doesn't refer to it Natalis, but he holds with Natalis that you have as many concepts of being as there are modes of being, or at least modes of being that you've encountered. And so you've got one concept of being for substance, another concept of being for quantity, another for quality, etc. If you had a direct grasp of the divine being, you would have a different concept of divine being than you would have of created being. Okay, so with Natalis insisting, where there's not community of natures, there is not community under a concept. Now, he doesn't explicitly use a distinction between formal and objective concepts in his treatment of the issue. So you have to sort of work out from context, is he talking about the thing as understood, objective concept, or is he talking about what's going on in your mind, formal concept?
I see.
And it would seem to me that he would insist that there has to be diversity in both cases, if you're dealing in the cases of analogy. And so then in terms of go ahead, your question.
And then how he tacks this on to the model problem is he's going to say that he's going to opt for the proportionality or model, or the principal model as you call it. He's going to part ways from Natalis on this point.
That's right. Yeah, he insists on using the what I've been calling the principal model of analogy. He seems to have in mind the same kind of argumentation that you'll find in, say, Aquinas's commentary on Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 6, where Aristotle talks about the ways in which good is said.
I see.
And Aristotle uses as an example to try to explain analogy how we use the word sight to refer to acts of the intellect and acts of the bodily organ. Okay, so you see your computer screen and you see the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, but it's not, there's nothing generically the same going on in here in the way in which you see color and in which the way in which you see the truth of a theory.
I see.
Okay, so likewise, goodness is not one genus. It doesn't belong to one genus. It cuts across genera. And Aristotle says, and this is the same thing with being and unity, that being and unity doesn't belong to just one genus. They cut across the genera and apply by analogy across the genera. Okay, so Sutton thinks that's the way to go for thinking about analogy as it applies to God and creatures.
All right, and then how does Sutton try to answer the equivocation problem in demonstration? I think he gives the example of how movers said of both creatures and of God. God is the unmoved mover. We receive our meaning, our motion paralleled from another. Does this lead to equivocation? And as I understand it, Sutton is taken with the idea that proportionality sort of preserves demonstration. There's a sort of sufficient unity when we employ proportionately analogous concepts that allows us to stave off equivocation.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says. He says that analogous unity, and meaning specifically this proportional unity or unity of analogy, is close enough to analogous to univocal unity to function in a valid syllogism. Okay, so if we were to take a step back, you can think about the modes of unity that Aristotle lays out in Metaphysics 5. All right, so Aristotle identifies 4 modes of unity in that text: numerical, specific, generic, and analogous. So numerical unity is the kind of unity that you have as a distinct from your table or as distinct from me. There's one of you. You are one human being and I'm one human being. We both have our numerical unity. Okay. Now, we also have a specific unity that we share. Okay. Specific unity of being human beings. And then we've got a generic unity with ourselves and say, do you have any pets?
Yeah, I got a dog. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a generic unity with your dog. You, me, and your dog were all animals. Now, within Aristotle's account, things that have specific unity and generic unity can be named univocally according to that unity. So we're univocally named human, and we are univocally human, and we are univocally animals with each other and with your dog. Right. Then the 4th mode of unity that he mentions is proportional unity or analogous unity. The word in Greek is analogia. And the kind of things he's thinking of for analogia is principal model analogy. So according to Sutton, this analogia kind of analogy, it's close enough to generic and specific unity to preserve demonstrations.
I see. So whereas with generic and specific unity, when we're employing the term animality to my dog Delta and animality to a capybara or animality to myself, it's said of in a univocal sense. But with, say, proportionality, the sight is to bodily organs as sight is to the agent intellect. That would be analogous terms. But they're so sufficiently united in proportionality that we don't fall into equivocation. It's sort of a middle ground between an equivocation and univocity.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a real kind of unity, this analogous or proportional unity, and it's sufficient to mediate syllogisms. Now he's going to need to put some qualifications on when is it sufficient to mediate syllogisms.
Sure.
But presumably he's going to say it's only insofar as we're talking about the things as proportionally the same.
I see.
As opposed to talking about the things insofar as they're not proportional.
I see.
The same.
All right. I think that all makes sense.